guys, it's Lizzie. So one of my Catholic friends made a joke that I should make a video, Lies Protestants Believe About Protestantism, because I made this video in May of this year, Lies Protestants Believe About Catholicism, and it got a lot of views, tons of comments, lots of controversy. And so I tell my friends about my videos, how they're going. So it's honestly become like an inside joke in my friend group, lies Protestants believe about something, even amongst like my Protestant and agnostic friends. But I've decided to actually film this video. So I hope it inspires you to go read and research into the early church and get deep into church history. Number one, we're not going by tradition. So every single type of church has a tradition or historical development of theology, which then impacts your doctrine and your interpretations of the Bible. One of my church history professors from college literally said this at Pepperdine Bible lectures earlier this year. This isn't a contentious thing. I think we have a connotation of tradition, and that means Catholic or Orthodox, but just the meaning of tradition, your church has a tradition. Every single church does. It's more of just choosing which tradition you want to be a part of. Number two, tradition versus sola scriptura is a dichotomy. So I made a 5-minute video that went more in depth about this a few weeks ago. I'm gonna link it right here. But basically, the early church did not have the Bible and went by oral tradition. Obviously, the Gospels were finished being written by the end of the 1st century. The epistles were written earlier. So there was scripture floating around. And when Catholics say things like it wasn't until the councils of the 4th century when we even got the Bible, like that's not true. They were just officially saying which books were part of the canon. The canon was already known by everyone way before that time. But the one thing that a lot of Protestants just get wrong is that we legitimately need tradition for the Bible, especially to prove the resurrection. All of the Gospels are anonymous if it is not for tradition. So the Apostle John taught this guy named Polycarp. So think of Polycarp as John's intern. So John taught Polycarp, who taught Irenaeus. So Irenaeus is the first Christian who's writing down who wrote the Gospels and that these 4 Gospels are legitimate and the true Gospels. Because there's the Gnostic Gospels floating around. Like everyone was writing fake Gospels at the time. It was a thing. And so we need Irenaeus to prove the authorship and authenticity of the Gospels. And so when you say, oh, I hate tradition, I'm only sola scriptura, it's like, well, tradition kind of created the Bible and we need tradition to prove the Bible. Number 3, I'm not Protestant, I'm non-denominational. At my church growing up, a lot of people were like, we're not Protestant, we're non-denominational. Like literally that happens so often and it's extremely frustrating. Just from an objective perspective, this is wrong. You're either Catholic, Orthodox, part of the Oriental Orthodox churches, which includes things like the Coptic Church, or you're a Protestant. Any type of Christian church that can historically be linked back to the Protestant Reformation, that developed from the Protestant Reformation, is Protestant. It doesn't matter how much you don't focus on the history. It doesn't matter how much you've changed from the original churches during the Reformation era. You're Protestant. If you're not Catholic or Orthodox, you're Protestant. Our church was established in 30 AD. So this is a quote from a video I made a while ago called Stuff Church of Christ People Say. And the reason it was funny is because most people who are Church of Christ know that this is not true. It's crazy to me. I was actually in a Bible class in Florida and they had like a white blank piece of paper and they were drawing a graph and they're like 30 AD to 2014. And they literally drew a line that is the Stone Campbell Movement Church of Christ. Unless you're doing like Gregorian chant a cappella style worship, the women are wearing head coverings and you have a charismata style prophecy stuff going on. You probably don't resemble the early church that much. And that's okay. You know, we have the theological truths, external worship style, and the charismata faded off after the apostles died. It was a really short thing. No one, regardless of what Christian church you're a part of, your church does not resemble the first few decades of the church. No one's church resembles that because it developed. Number 5, there's one way to go by the Bible. So I think a lot of churches are under the impression that sola scriptura means that if your church is pure sola scriptura, you're going by the Bible and every other church is not going by the Bible. And the fact that there's 30,000 Protestant denominations who are all trying to go by the Bible shows that there's just not one way to be sola scriptura. Like I said with number one, every single Protestant church is part of a tradition that chooses to interpret the Bible in different ways. It's impossible to find one way that everyone can agree on in how to interpret the Bible unless you have like the Pope or something that can keep the Christian truths contained through the years. Just a thought. But you know what I mean? Like, the most Christians of any group are Catholic, and the reason that's able to work without constantly breaking out into new churches is because they have one person who's the leader, who's telling everyone how to interpret the Bible. But every Protestant church also has tradition and doctrines and dogmas, even if they don't realize it. I really recommend this book called After Virtue by Alistair McIntyre. It kind of explains what happened during the Enlightenment to get to the modern era, why we are the way we are, politically, philosophically, theologically. And he talks about this concept called empiricism, which is a brand new concept where you can just read a text and just by reading the text get to the truth of the text just on your own. That didn't exist in the early church for a majority of Christendom. And if you use empiricism with one text, I mean, it makes sense that you're going to get thousands of different interpretations. Number 6, Protestantism was started over theology. Yes, but mostly no. Martin Luther wanted to reform the Catholic Church. His intention from the beginning was not to leave. It kind of just snowballed and became what it is today. The reason the Protestant Reformation was so successful is because the Pope was in charge of the Holy Roman Empire. And even though there were autonomous nations, the Pope had a ton of power because of Catholicism, Christianity. So when the leaders of these countries figured out that if they became a Protestant country, and in Germany, it was the princes of the different regions got to individually decide if they were Catholic or Protestant. So we can't look back in history and tell whether or not someone had pure intentions and was like really devout about their faith, really devout about being Protestant or not. Like, we can't know that 100%. But from a lot of what I've read, it seems like they had ulterior motives for becoming Protestant. And when a leader of a country or when a leader of a region in Germany became Protestant, all the people in their region also became Protestant. It wasn't like a ton of individual people were like reading through things on their own and like deciding to leave the Catholic Church. It was extremely political. It was a power struggle. It was this advantageous way to get away from the power structure of the Pope. Number 7, communion in the early church was meant to be symbolic. So the way I grew up learning is that communion is about remembering Jesus. It's a symbol, but I've researched the early church recently, and in the 2nd and the 1st century even, besides the heretic groups like the Gnostics and the Montanists, everyone else who was a Christian in the early church believed in this real presence view of communion, which means the communion transformed into Jesus. Transubstantiation is a way the Catholics now understand communion, whereas the Orthodox think of it more as a holy mystery that we don't have to try to define and explain. But from every single document we have from the early church, and we have a lot of documents, I'm gonna link below a website called Early Church Writings that has all the writings of the early church, so you can read for yourself and see how they talk about communion. But they believed in the real presence view so much that their surrounding pagan culture literally accused the Christians of being cannibalists. And you can even see this view in the Bible. Every single communion passage, Jesus says, "Take, eat, this is my body. Take, drink, this is my blood of the new covenant." Paul even uses that language, "Take, eat, this is my body," when he talks about communion in 1 Corinthians. But the most compelling Bible passage is in John 6, when Jesus is giving the bread of life discourse. Jesus literally says 4 times, "Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood." You have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And so there's a huge crowd, and his disciples who'd been following him around, not like the 12 apostles, but just some of his disciples who'd been following him around, begin to leave. They literally leave. And they're like, this is a really difficult passage. And instead of clarifying that maybe it's a metaphor or something, Jesus keeps saying, "You must eat my flesh and drink my blood." 4 times in this passage, people begin to leave. Doesn't seem like a metaphor. I really invite you to go through the New Testament and 1 Corinthians, read all of the communion passages, read John 6. It might help you understand number 1, where I talked about how every church has a tradition, because my whole life I never saw the real presence meaning in it. But then learning that in the 1st and 2nd century, every Christian saw it as the real presence and saw communion as being transforming into Jesus, it's difficult to view communion as not being the real presence that Jesus seems to be directly speaking about when he was on earth. Those were the 7 lies that some Protestants believe about Protestantism. I don't believe these lies anymore because I did research and read about the early church and what was going on during the Reformation era. Comment below if you have any questions, or you can DM me, email me. I would love to give any of you book recommendations, but for sure check out the early church writings website. Just like how in the New Testament, Paul and Peter would write super encouraging letters, instructions to the Christians, that continued with the 2nd, 3rd generation of Christians, where the leaders would write letters to people clarifying doctrines, stamping out heresies. So it's super interesting seeing what Christianity was like in the 1st and 2nd century. I love you guys so much, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!